So, most of you probably know what the email is because either of the hairstyle or the way the majority of them dress. According to Luke O'Neill, he was a writer for MTV.com and many other publications. In 2015 of February, he was interviewed Taking Back Sundays and Lazera. He stated that you can't provide something that hasn't died. I will inform you in this speech. I'll inform you about the history of email music and how it came to be. The first thing I'll talk about is how the history of email between the 80s and between the early 80s and the early 2000s. The second thing I'll talk about is how email music disappeared between the early 2000s until 2010s. Lastly, I'll talk about the email revival, the current state of which email is actually in. The first thing I'll talk about is the history of email music between the 80s and the early 2000s. According to Andy Randon, who was the bass player of Funeral Diner, on his website, forfeit.com, stated that emo has roots of emo porn, and also stated that these bands at this time played with hardcore punk bands, got burnt out of its limited form, and moved on to a more guitar-oriented, high-pitched registry scene. That was from 85 until 89. The second phase of emo is actually called emo, where most of the bands, when they played in live settings, normally turn around during the quiet parts and speak really softly. And most of the time, the lead singer of whoever the band is playing didn't have enough time to reach the mic. So you had to scream on the top of his lungs, which most of the audience couldn't even hear. Either if the screaming is during the quiet parts, it can be a very powerful tactic. From the early 90s until the 2000s, many of these bands started switching over to more indie alternative rock, which is still incorporated emo. One of the bands at the time was Sunday Real Estate, who often combined post-hardcore, alternative rock, and emo all into one package. Other bands such as Jimmy Eat World and Dashboard Professional are considered mall emo because most of them are played at malls or were signed to major record labels. The second thing I'll talk about is how emo disappeared between the early 2000s and the 2010s. Although emo disappeared because no one really paid attention to it. While many of these bands were still being made, oftentimes either they're changing their sounds or were breaking up. As stated before, Jimmy Eat World switched from a more emo sound to a more alternative rock towards the latter half of their discography. My Chemical Romance, for example, although it's not considered emo because of their use of eyeliner or wearing all black unintentionally, switched to more pop punk towards the latter half of their discography before they broke up last year. Fall Out Boy and Paramore, also considered emo, switched to more alternative rock, which most of you probably heard today on the radio or inside the malls. The last thing I'll talk about is the emo revival, the current state of which emo actually is. One of the many forerunners of this era is called The World is a Beautiful Place, I'm No Longer Afraid to Die, and Into It, Over It. More often, such as before, many of the bands have nauseatingly long song titles, or nauseatingly long band names that have nothing to do with the actual song, and vice versa. Most of the bands often include acoustic, emo, pop punk, cello, orchestra, etc. Two examples of this type of sound are from the bands The Front Bottoms and Mono Baseball, which combine emo, acoustic, and pop punk all into one package. According to Eric Decker, who is a freelance writer for NPR, who was interviewing Brad Nelson, who is also involved in the industry or the scene in 2013, he stated that the diversity of the band changed in a relatively short amount of time, and diversity of the audience changed. In this speech, I just informed you about the history of emo music, how it came to be between the early 80s and the 2000s. Second thing is how emo disappeared between the 2000s and the 2010s. And lastly, how the emo revival to current state of emo is actually in right now.